A lot of coverage on this subject at the moment, Ted. I I was surprised because I wasn't aware of the 77 book. I guess there's obviously a massive reason to re-release this. I guess timing is probably the first thing, Ted, more than anything. Would I be right with that?
Well, the UFO phenomenon changed a little bit. When I published my book in 1977, I was quite persuaded that I had understood what was going on. I was looking at structures of interpretation for these most unusual experiences, and I could see, for the most part, that people's experiences and thoughts about UFOs were quite positive. In fact, there were a lot of sublimated religious dimensions to the UFO phenomenon, and many people were hoping that an advanced extraterrestrial civilization would bring Earth the equivalent of salvation, world peace, and longer life, etc. But in the 1980s, a new thing was added, namely these very negative abduction experiences where people are arrested from their bed out of sleep in the middle of the night, taken aboard a craft, and they're abused, or at least they appear to be abused sexually, etc. And there's some reproduction going on. Some women claim to be impregnated, and some men have their sperm removed, evidently to use to make these hybrid babies that are a mixture of spacelings and earthlings. And then some women especially claim to have been abducted multiple times, and when they're taken aboard the craft, they're handed a baby, allegedly their own baby, and these feelingless grays watch them to see how they nurse their baby, evidently wanting to learn something about affection and motherhood and related matters. Mm-hmm. And initially, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, these people had negative experiences. They didn't like these experiences, whereas previously UFO abductions were religious turning points. Suddenly we get these negative ones, and that is what warranted the second edition of the book. I needed to somehow or other grapple with the meaning of this second category of abductions and see if I could integrate it at all with what I had learned previously.
Why do you feel that the change to this negative abduction phenomena to...
Well, I have a hypothesis which I ask the reader to consider, and it has to do with culture. The continuity between the earlier and the later forms of UFO abduction is hypnotic regression to retrieve forgotten memories. As you may be aware, the technique of hypnotic regression actually was born in the UFO movement. Back in 1961, Betty and Barney Hill claimed to have been abducted by UFOnauts. And a psychiatrist in Boston named Benjamin Simon had used hypnotic regression in order to retrieve memories of the abduction which occurred during a period in which they were unconscious. Mm-hmm. That abduction experience included both conscious and unconscious dimensions, but what was startling was the use of hypnotic regression to draw out the details. Well, in the late 60s, then through the 70s, you've got UFO investigators, Leo Sprinkle, James Harder, and others are using Benjamin Simon's technique for the purpose of gaining data about UFOs. And then in 1980, there's a big change. And what happens there, a book is published where a psychiatrist named Pazder is now using hypnotic regression to interview a woman named Michelle. The book is called Michelle Remembers, not to retrieve the memory of a UFO abduction, but rather childhood sexual abuse and satanic ritual abuse. By 1982 in America, and I don't know if this happened in the UK, but it certainly happened in America, about 100 preschools are now in court with the preschool operators being prosecuted for sexual abuse and satanic ritual abuse, and the evidence used against them is gained through the hypnotic regression of the children who report sexual abuse and satanic ritual abuse. And in the Los Angeles County area, the biggest court trial was the McMartin preschool trial, which began about 1982 and ended about 1987, if memory serves me. And eventually, the McMartins, it's a mother-daughter combination, were found innocent. The parents had claimed that there was an underground subterranean worship center, ritual center for satanic ritual abuse, and the children were taken down there and abused. And, of course, when they dug down underneath the McMartin school, no such thing was there. But the evidence that seemed to clear the McMartins was that the counselors who were getting the testimony from the children were leading the children. So that's 1987 now. And just about then, we get a spate of books from a group of authors, Whitley Strieber and Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and then in the 1990s, John Mack, in which they're using hypnotic regression. They're retrieving now abusive stories that look kind of like sexual abuse and satanic abuse. And to me, the common denominator there in all of it is hypnotic regression. And so I just lay that before the reader and say, hey, what do you think? Could there be cultural winds blowing here?
Sure.
And I raised this with the researchers at John Mack's research group in Boston. And, oh, my gosh, they were horrified that I would suggest such a hypothesis. But something's got to account for the big change, and that's the best shot I can give it.
I got you. So throw this one out there, Ted. Have you ever had a UFO experience yourself of any class or any encounter? Witnessed?
I have not, but I've interviewed numerous witnesses, and I'm sometimes envious. Hey, I wish I could have that experience too.
Sure. People that have been abducted, have you interviewed people, abductees as well?
I have, mainly of the first type, but some also of the second type as well. And I've even talked with a couple of people who claim they're hybrids.
Wow. How long have you been interested in flying saucers, UFOs, whatever, these craft? How long does this go back, Ted?
Well, I started as a kid. It's post-genetic, to be sure, but it still goes back quite a ways. My mom and dad used to read the books by the great contactees and went to hear public lectures by George Adamski and others among the contactees who claimed that they know what's going on at other planets, and the space visitors are going to come and do really good things for us on Earth. And so already as a kid, I was fascinated with this subject. Many years later, I became a professor, and I specialized in the interaction between science and religion. I thought, oh, my goodness, what a case study, because people in ufology, for the most part, think of themselves as scientific, but the establishment scientists, such as you find at SETI or NASA or other places, boy, they won't have anything to do with the ufologists because they think they're kooks and pseudoscientists and stuff like that. So I find, oh, this is interesting. I need to look into this.
Wow. No. So UFOs, do you think there's any sort of crafts that are made out in Area 51 that could be human? Do you think we're trying to maybe back engineer extraterrestrial craft? Do you think it's a mixture of both? Do you think the story is more complex, is what I'm alluding to, than we actually could even conceive?
I made my pilgrimage to Area 51, as so many have, and peered through the fence, etc. recently, we've learned quite a bit about Area 51 as a weapons testing site, and whether or not there really are any captured UFOs there, I can't say one way or the other. I would like to think that they're there, but we don't have decisive evidence. On the question of reverse engineering, which you raised, this is an important one, which I've tried to investigate. The claim has been made that in 1947, when the Army Air Force captured a crashed flying saucer in Roswell, New Mexico, that they used the technology from that in order to jumpstart a number of advances in technology. One of these was one claim was made that there was a laser in that 1947 spaceship, and that's what led to the development of the laser on Earth. Well, by coincidence, I happen to know the guy who invented the laser. His name is Charlie Towns, and he did this along with a colleague in the 1950s. So I approached Dr. Towns and said, Charlie, did you get any help from outer space to invent the laser? He says, what are you talking about? Wow. So I gave him some of the literature about reverse engineering, and I said, did you really come up with this idea of the laser on your own, or did it come from outer space? And he said, of course, there was no influence from outer space at all. And he explained how the invention of the laser took place, which laboratories worked on it, who were on those teams, etc. So I said, would you mind giving me a letter? So I put the letter from Dr. Towns in the book. On the other hand, there's something nicely mysterious about this. It's got nothing to do with UFOs, and that is the design of the laser was the result of a religious experience, that the team that was working on it were quite frustrated because they couldn't get it. And Charlie was eating his lunch one day and suddenly had a vision, and he got out his pencil and he copied the vision down on his brown lunch bag and took it back to a meeting, and they had the laser. And Charlie even now thinks that science is as much revelation as it is, discovery. And they tell me, I've not seen it, they tell me there is now a bronze bench somewhere in Washington, D.C., that marks the spot where Charlie had his vision of the laser.
Wow.
So at any rate, the bottom line is, at least on this technology, we didn't need to reverse engineer something from outer space.
Wow. So, Ted, you're a theologian. You're into religious studies. What's the bit for you with UFOs? What's the attraction? Do you see the two linked in any way?
Well, the part of the UFO phenomenon that I enjoy the most is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Outer space is an exciting thing. I like to say that I've got outer space in my inner soul. But I'm not alone on that. It's a widespread cultural fantasy, I think, that goes on in the human mind, that we like the idea that somehow or other we can imagine our own psyche understanding, comprehending this great, magnificent, and infinite universe. So I've got that's sort of a spirituality of space. But then, quite specifically, I've had a research project because there's a widespread rumor about, and you can find it sometimes in the media, and you find it sometimes amongst establishment scientists, that the world's religions are in trouble. That if the world's religions were suddenly confronted with the knowledge that we're not alone, that we share the universe with other intelligent creatures, that these religions would face a crisis and collapse. And I thought, gee, this doesn't seem right, but
I don't believe that, Ted. I don't believe that for a minute.
Everybody believes it. You don't. What do you think, James?
I don't believe that for a minute. I think, that's really putting humans down. It's really putting down human consciousness. I think, we're pretty evolved in at least that argument that, I don't think we're all going to lie down and panic and fear. And, I think we would be civil about it and intellectual about it and go, okay, I think there'll be a little bit of hysteria and discussion and philosophizing, but, I don't think it would be what you portrayed there, this thing we're given.
Well, what you're saying is what intuitively I thought and still think will be the case, but I decided to try to test for it. So I came up with the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey, which you mentioned in your opening introduction.
Sure.
And with the help of a graduate student, we asked people to identify their own religious position, and then to answer a question such as this. There were 10 questions, but here's the interesting one. If we were to confirm the existence of a race of intelligent creatures on another planet, would your own personal religious beliefs face a crisis or, collapse, something to that effect? Well, the response was fascinating, that in virtually every religious tradition, we had at least 92% say either it would be a neutral matter or it would be a positive affirmation of their own religious beliefs. Less than 8% of Roman Catholics felt that there would be a crisis. And that was true for mainline Protestants, for evangelical Protestants. It was true for, for Jewish people who claim to be Jewish. And when it came to people self-selecting as Buddhists and as Mormons, it was fascinating. It was like 100% said, no, I'm not going to have a problem. We didn't have enough Muslims for it to be numerically significant, but we did get comments such as, I can't believe that Allah would create this very large universe and have only us here on Earth as part of the divine plan. And so those people who self-selected as belonging to one religious tradition or another, no problem. My favorite comment came from a mainline Protestant who said, I'd share a pew with an alien any Sunday.
Wow. Ted, personally, I think we have been visited in the past, for sure, in an ancient alien hypothesis. Personally, I feel that in terms of technology and many other reasons. I think, obviously, human ingenuity should not be erased because I think we've done a lot of stuff ourselves as well. However, are we still being visited today? I haven't seen any proof of that. I've never witnessed anything myself. I just talk to other people and do shows. But however, regardless of whether we're talking about an ancient alien hypothesis or a recent visitation of craft, I'm guessing we're going to have to put these guys as being higher evolved than us.
This is an item that I spend a lot of time on in the book, and so let's take that apart. They would be more highly evolved than we would be. Note, there's an assumption that you may be giving voice to that you find both in the scientific community as well as amongst the UFO community, and that is that if you give evolution enough time, it will progress towards intelligence, and then intelligence will lead to science and technology. And that science and technology will lead right through the temptation to have war to a kind of situation of peace that lies beyond that. And so if we can imagine an extraterrestrial civilization that might be 10,000 years older than we are, or 1 million years older than we are, imagine just how intelligent and scientific and technologically progressive they're going to be. I call that a myth. It sounds like science, but it's not science. It's really a product of imagination. Our evolutionary biologists stamped their feet and hollered, no, no, evolution is not progressive. There is nothing in the evolutionary process that would lead it towards intelligence as a constant goal in one fashion or another. In addition to that, they also like to point out that the origin of life is not part of evolution proper. So whatever happens on a planet that gives birth to life is not something that can be predictable. So even if a planet is old, there's no scientific reason to think that life would have begun there. So what I want to point out is that this idea that ETI would be more advanced than we are and advanced in the way that science advances is a good idea for scientists because, well, they like to think that they're pretty important and that the whole of evolution up until this point has led to them. And not only that, that if we had more evolution, we'd have even brighter scientists than we do now. And wouldn't it be wonderful to have them come and visit us on Earth and give us all the blessings of their highly evolved science and technology? I find this to be a myth. That doesn't mean it's false. It could very well be true, but currently there's no empirical evidence whatsoever to support it. And theoretically, there's not even a theory of evolution that would support that view. So if we want to take science seriously, I think we would want to say it's plausible, but not probable.
Sure. That is a more politically correct way of saying it. That is true, Ted. In terms of an ancient astronaut theory or an ancient alien hypothesis, I mean, you wrote the first edition around the time, not too far from Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, and there's a lot of discussion around that time frame of an ancient alien hypothesis. Do you feel that we might have got a jump start early on in our civilization?
Yes, Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods and his many books advancing and in some ways fixing the paradigm for the ancient alien hypothesis was flowering in the 1970s, and I felt compelled at that time to try to analyze the ancient astronaut theory, and if anything, it's stronger now than it was when von Daniken kicked it off. I did have a chance to meet him once as we talked at a radio station in Detroit, Michigan on one occasion. Nice man. I like him. I am not persuaded. That doesn't mean, again, it's false, but I'm not persuaded mainly because a lot of the evidence is weak. For example, von Daniken and some of today's ancient astronaut theorists think, the pyramids in Egypt, they're so marvelous. Our ancient ancestors were not smart enough to build those things, so maybe they got jump-started by an extraterrestrial technology. Well, that's not really a good explanation because the instructions on how to build a pyramid are written inside the pyramid, as archaeologists have found, and in some cases there's even the name of the architect, there's the name of the contractor, and the description about how they were built. Also, the pyramids were built over a long period of time, maybe a millennium or so. And you can see how the designs changed over the centuries. They got better and better at it, just the way we would expect any development in terrestrial technology to occur. So I want to say I like the excitement of the extraterrestrial hypothesis and the ancient astronaut theory, but I'm not persuaded by the evidence that they usually bring up. But my family, we still watch the History 2 channel, and we watch every episode. I
Sure.
keep thinking, well, maybe somebody will prove it. But to my evaluation, no, they've not proven it to me yet.
I think there's the one thing they allude to in the show, that a lot of the world religions, all have some sort of an ancient alien influence or ancient alien hypothesis. It's a core body of the show, as you rightly know, as a theologian. They touch on a lot of theology, but, do you think there's any truth to that or anything to that, the traditional religions of the world, have ancient alien roots?
I think it's possible. I'm not really persuaded. Again, as you can imagine, I'm the kind of a person who's going to really find this very interesting, to go back and look at ancient literature and the Bible, as well as ancient texts, Egyptian, Greek. Everybody likes Enuma Elish from ancient Sumeria and Babylonia. And take a look at them and just see if we can read through the text and see what looks like alien visitation. And I do understand why some of those texts make it look that way. Everybody likes Genesis 6, the Nephilim who come down from heaven and marry the daughters of earth. Could that be the first hybrid race? And that kind of text is not unique to the Bible. You can find that in a number of ancient myths. So the question is alien visitation the best explanation or not? One of the things that is prominent in the field called the history of religions is certain symbolic structures that seem to appear in culture after culture. And one of them is the marriage of heaven and earth. That certainly in agricultural societies, the sky was thought to be male and the earth was female, and the rain was a form of impregnation, and then the growing crops were the progeny of this marriage of heaven and earth, and that occurs in every ancient society, agricultural society, with the exception of one, and that's Egypt. And the reason it's not in Egypt is there's no rain there. So the earth becomes male, etc., and it's the Nile River which provides the crops. So the exception almost proves the rule. So what's important to note that it is a natural phenomenon to connect heaven with earth. And also ancient societies, as they were becoming civil, that is to say, city-state societies, would have high points. They'd have towers, certainly pyramids in Mesoamerica and pyramids in Egypt. Then you'd have the ziggurats, or the big tall towers there in ancient Sumer, Akkad, and Babylonia, and places like that. And again, you've got the marriage of heaven and earth going on here. And I think that probably is a good enough explanation for these things. Does that mean that the ancient astronaut theory is wrong on every point? No, I don't want to say that. I just want to say we probably don't need that explanation because other explanations seem to work well enough.
Yeah, I think one shortcoming of the show Ancient Aliens is they take it a bit too far, but it is popularized to, I think there's a core body of very interesting, 70% anyway, is very, very interesting, and there's a little 30% embellishment, to say the least. What do you think about the Ezekiel's wheel? I think Von Daniken.
Well, I think the vision of Ezekiel's wheel is tantalizing, and I can certainly see why you might want to give that a flying saucer explanation. Again, I don't want to rule that out. There are some texts that really lend themselves to the extraterrestrial explanation for them, or at least an advanced technology. I think that's the claim. We would need an advanced technology for some of these phenomena, and maybe that technology came to us from space. It's reasonable on the face of it, but is it a clincher? Well,
sure,
not yet to me.
Sure. what do you think about people then? I think did you work with MUFON before? I think it was. You were,
MUFON, the
yeah.
Mutual UFO Network,
Mm.
I have actually been a member for, I don't want to tell you how long. It's been a long time.
A long time.
But yes, I would do investigations for them, and I enjoyed that immensely. And sometimes daylight discs or fly-by-nights or even abduction cases, etc. And one of the things that I noticed that really got me going here as background for this book was how people interpreted their experiences. Their first experience is with an unknown. That's why we use the word unidentified and unidentified flying object. Unknown. And initially, boy, I don't know what happened to me. People are struggling to get words, to explain it. But then a couple of weeks later, oh, they've got the whole story. There's an extraterrestrial civilization, and it's full of intelligent and scientifically advanced beings, blah, blah, blah. One of my favorite examples of this was a case in Louisiana where I was able to get there within 24 hours of the experience, and two guys in a boat in a bayou were hunting nutria. Nutria is a kind of muskrat kind of animal, and they hunt at night, and they've got shotguns and things like that, and a putt-putt motor. And when I got there, they described this light. Oh, what is it? What kind of a light? Well, I don't know. It was just this big light, and it descended down to 75 feet in altitude above them, and it paralyzed everything. The boat, even though the engine was still running, the boat wouldn't move. The hair stood up on end, and they couldn't move their bodies. They could talk. They talked about shooting it, but their bodies were paralyzed. They were unable to lift their guns, and this went on, I don't remember if it was 5 minutes or something like that. So when I first interviewed them, boy, they didn't have the words. They were just shocked. They were afraid, and it was... from my point of view, it was wonderful that they had such a hard time describing an obviously strange experience. Well, I went back 2 weeks later, and one of the wives of the two firemen, they happened to be firemen, had in that time read a number of books and magazine articles and everything, and she was convinced that her husband and friend were visited by extraterrestrial intelligent beings from this advanced civilization in space, and she had the whole story down, including that they're more highly evolved than we are and stuff like that. And then they began to report paranormal experiences, visions of dead relatives, and specifically, and things of this particular nature. And what I was able to do was just sort of witness a mushrooming of meaning or interpretation going on. And what I do in the book, UFOs, God's Chariots, is I try to track how the interpretations grow and what kinds of structures they develop, and what the continuity is between these structures of interpretation and the wider culture.
So, Ted, as a theologian, then, you must have a very unique background to be talking to eyewitnesses, seeing patterns in the testimony, patterns in, what these guys are telling you and are orating their experiences. Do any of them, do you see a pattern of people treating it as a spiritual experience? Do any, as a theologian, you would recognize that?
Yes, I do. That's exactly where my strength is, that I can see spiritual sensibilities coming to expression in disguised form or secularized form, or I even say scientized form. The book is organized around 4 structures of interpretation. Visiting space aliens have political significance, and so there's a political structure. I call it the interstellar diplomat. What dominates it is the second structure or model, and that's the research scientist. Quite frequently, the spacelings are described like our scientists coming here to do research. And in some of the abduction cases, they're doing research on human bodies, you know. Then the third one is the spiritual one. I call it the celestial savior, that they're going to come from this more highly evolved society. They're going to bring the goodies of science and technology. And most importantly, they're going to protect us from self-destruction. And self-destruction takes the form either of a nuclear war or not failing to protect our planet from environmental degradation. And then those are the three models I had in the first edition. But then I had to add this fourth one that I mentioned earlier, the hybridizer, where you get the abuse theme, and you get the real prominence now of hypnotic regression to retrieve forgotten memories. And then you get this scenario of the marriage of heaven and earth with the hybrid race. And I try to develop that. I have to say that I find that one more difficult to understand, yet it is quite distinctive from the other three, even though there are elements of numbers 2 and 3 in the hybridizer model too, model as well.
Sure. So Ted, you know, do you think then, let's say we have some space brothers out there, they're coming to visit Earth, they have a good agenda, presuming they have a good agenda, do you think for a minute, if that's the case, that, you know, the government might not like this and that the government could spread a disinformation campaign? Do you look at that angle? Do you think that it's, you know, these could be good guys and our governments could be trying to cover up and a whole, because there is a whole disinformation and, you know, a call for release of knowledge?
I think it's pretty clear that disinformation has already been pretty much the policy of the U.S. government. I don't know about other nations, but we've had disinformation from 1947 on. And those ufologists who are asking for disclosure, asking for Uncle Sam to come clean and open the files, I kind of look forward to seeing them win in this public debate. Is it a conspiracy? Is the government really up to something sinister? I tend to think no. For two reasons. Number one, the government of the United States is so clumsy. I have a hard time believing that it could get along, you know, for 7 decades with a sustained conspiracy. And many of my ufologist friends are going to just dispute with me on that one. I think the other issue is the U.S. Air Force and related government spokespeople have said repeatedly their only concern is national security. And yes, they're going to study unidentified aerial objects insofar as it's a matter of national security. And after that, they don't care. Well, I think there's at least a partial truth to that. I don't accept that as the last word, but I can also see why government officials might get kind of frustrated after a while when they say, look, here's the report. No national security issues here. Take the report if you want it. And then the ufologists say, oh, but give us the next report and the next report. So it's hard to know if there's a bottom to this well.
So Ted, you worked with NASA and SETI as a consultant. Tell us a little bit about that. What's their position on UFOs? We know, I guess, SETI to some extent, what SETI's looking for, to search for extraterrestrial life. But what's NASA's really true philosophy of it?
Yeah, well, there are two issues there. One, did I give them any advice that they wanted to take? And then secondly, how do NASA scientists and SETI scientists relate to the UFO phenomenon? And by and large, the scientists you'll get to know at NASA and SETI really want to stay as far away from the UFO phenomenon as they can possibly get. They don't like ufology. And if you ask them why, what's your problem with the UFO people, their answer is they don't have any proof of extraterrestrial existence. Well, what counts as proof? Well, if you're a laboratory scientist, such as those you find at NASA or SETI, you want the kind of data that can be double-checked or experiments that can be repeated. And their objection to the UFO community, and I've heard this many times, so I think I'm reporting it faithfully, is that UFO evidence is anecdotal in character. It's not scientific in the laboratory sense. It's only anecdotes, and anecdotes are not trustworthy from a scientific point of view. So I use the image of the summer barbecue. If you're a SETI or NASA scientist, you're going to throw a barbecue. You're only going to invite your friends, and nobody who's into UFOs is going to be on your guest list. And similarly, when the ufologists get together for a barbecue, they don't invite the SETI or NASA people either. I find myself going to both barbecues, but I keep saying, hey, why don't you guys invite each other? There is, and this is a point that I like to make, and I would like my SETI and NASA friends to listen, is that within the UFO community, such as MUFON that I had mentioned earlier, there really is a scientific mindset. In fact, many of these people actually have doctor's degrees in one or another natural science. And they want to carefully weigh evidence. They don't want to jump to conclusions. They would really like to solve the mystery, and they have a scientific mindset. Yes, they have a problem. They can only deal with anecdotal evidence. That's a problem. But certainly they're rational people who want to approach the subject rationally. And there's a little bit more in common between the ufologists and the establishment scientists than some people would like to admit.
Wow. Wow, fascinating. You know, for me, I think NASA would love to be open with its philosophy, Ted. I think they would love to be saying, you know, they want to go to Mars because we really think there's something there. And I think they would, you know, the structures that are there are incredibly interesting. But I think SETI has a more open philosophy on things. I think NASA, you know, you would know NASA more than better than me, but I just think NASA's in a bit of a typecast itself, I think, into a role. And, you know, a lot of people are very, maybe outside America, but a lot of people are very, they see NASA as some mysterious institution who's not very open, you know. Maybe I'm wrong with that.
Yes, I don't have a thoroughgoing knowledge of NASA, but
people are wary of them, Ted. A lot of people are wary of them outside America, I should say.
Yeah, well, my observation is that the same scientists circulate back and forth between SETI and NASA. In fact, SETI, which is located only an hour's drive from where I live, SETI has a number of research contracts given them by NASA, so they're doing research on behalf of NASA.
Wow!
And to my observation, they get along very well. NASA tends to be more interested in what's going on within our solar system, the moon, Mars, the other planets, the moons of the other planets, and they are looking for microbial life, etc. SETI it almost ignores this solar system and is looking for exoplanets, that is to say, intelligent civilizations that might exist on other star systems, and they're using radio telescopes primarily for that. So in some ways, they almost have separate agendas, even though the same kinds of principles of astrobiology and astrophysics and related fields, you know, are employed by both, but they have slightly different research agendas.
Mm-hmm. For sure, Ted, for sure. Bear with me on this one, Ted. I mean, you know, in terms of UFO cases or people, you know, I think you got a group of people that have something happen to them with either seeing a UFO or, they've have a personal interaction, whatever, of whatever kind, the third, fourth kind, and you have that type of people. You've got people, so, they're going to believe in it 100% hardcore, and you've got people that would believe in UFOs because of some logical, rational thought. And then you've got another group of people that will just believe in it because they actually want it, they like it, and they want it to be. Now, they're very, very different groups of people who would believe, and in the whole genre, do you think it's become a secularized religion in terms of its own little field? Not to take away from anybody who's had a personal experience, or not to take away from anybody who has a logical rationale. And perhaps I'm applying this to the last group of people who just believe in it because they want it to be true. And in a way, they steal the show in terms of like it becoming a secularized religion. Do you think that's the case that we see portrayed?
Well, I'm quite sympathetic to the group you just mentioned, those who really want to believe. I understand that. And as I suggested earlier, you sometimes find that amongst our most reputable space scientists, too. The same I want to believe that you find amongst so-called UFO believers. And the only caution I give is just distinguish what's scientific from what it is that we hope to be the case, and we're going to be healthy. But when that distinction is blurred, then you get this secular religion that we've both been talking about here, where the hope for salvation is no longer going to come to us from God's grace. No, it's going to come from a super technological society on another planet. Well, what is it that we really worship? Well, we really worship science and technology then. We really hope that science and technology is going to give us all these good things, but unfortunately the scientists are in cahoots with governments, and they make bombs and they destroy things, and they make weapons of mass destruction and etc. So the science on Earth is not pure. But maybe the science on this other planet is pure. And so you see this spiritual hope, which actually looks quite a bit like a delusion developing. And you see it, you can see it widespread, and the UFO phenomenon is one place to look at it.
Personally, I believe in the vastness of space, Ted, that, of all the planets and all the galaxies, there's other humanoids or earthling type creatures out there. I mean, statistically, it has to be. I mean, I believe in a God, and I believe in whether that's an intelligent designer or a highly evolved being entity. I don't know. I just have personal things that happen to me that I just see a lot of coincidences happening at me in life. And I found spirituality later on. I tried my best not to believe in spirituality and to go against it. And I followed the scientific doctrine in my early 20s, and I came back around again, and I have a belief in God. However, I do also have a belief in statistics, and I have a belief in statistically, I really do believe in the vastness of space. Would you share that philosophy in a way? That there is statistically...
I do. I have a slight caveat, and that is that to be scientific, you have to have something empirical and not just numbers. But it's easy to be impressed by the numbers. I call it the big number argument. I mean, if we've got hundreds of billions of stars within our own Milky Way, and we're beginning to get a ratio now of how many planets per star. But even if you just gave it one planet per star.
Simple math.
And then, and if 1 out of 10 of those is in the habitable zone, I mean, you have an enormous number of places where life could be sponsored. And then you just multiply that. For another 100 billion galaxies. I mean, you're right. It's just, how could it not be the case that we've got space neighbors, and we can't even begin to count them. So I understand that form of thinking. It's not empirical. It's numbers, and the numbers are coming out of thin air. But I do understand why people make this argument. But let's get back to you and God and the scientists and the universe.
Hmm.
One of the slight slippages in our culture that's worth pointing out
Sure.
is that scientists today, especially astrobiologists and astrophysicists,
Hmm.
argue, they don't even argue, they assume that the same laws of physics that we can test here on this planet apply to every other planet, to every other galaxy in the universe. And if you think about it, if they didn't make that assumption, they couldn't study the universe. So they have to believe that the universe is rationally structured and that the laws of nature we have here are everywhere. Well, if we just go back a couple centuries, where did that belief come from? Well, when science was rising in Western Europe, with Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler and Newton, the really big brains who gave us modern science, they all believed in God, and they all believe that God has a rational mind, and that part of the blessings is that God has given the human race a rational mind, and that is why we can study the world in confidence that we're understanding the world as it is. So what you get today among scientists is a belief in God, but they don't say it's a belief in God. I have faith that the laws of nature that I study here on Earth are going to be true in Zeta 2 Reticuli, and they're going to be true in the Andromeda, etc. And that is a faith they inherited from the days when scientists still believed in God, and now they can just call it reason. But it's possible that, maybe you are still where Isaac Newton was, and that's not too bad a company.
A lot of philosophy creeps into this. As a theologian, you must dabble in a lot of philosophy as well, Ted.
Oh, yes, you must. I'm a Lutheran, and Lutherans, for the most part, do not need philosophy. Roman Catholics do. They're the ones that really remember the philosophy. But I happen to think that philosophical analysis is worth a whole lot, so that we can understand how it is that we're understanding things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, us little humans like to think ourselves as the center of the world, and do you think ET's coming here, in the open, that is, I should say, being an accepted phenomena would destroy us? Like, do you think it would break us down? I don't mean religions falling apart. I mean, as a human perspective, that we are on this earth, and do you think it would destroy something in our consciousness or our society?
I don't know if I'd use the verb destroy, but it's going to shock us.
Yeah.
We certainly have been the kingpins here on Earth, and nobody, at least in the last couple of centuries, no other animal or no other phenomenon has challenged human superiority. We still have a few problems with volcanoes and hurricanes and tornadoes, but we're doing pretty well with regard to everything else on Earth in terms of being numero uno. And yes, it is going to shock us. I don't think it's a religious issue particularly. It's more of a power issue. We might begin to feel vulnerable. And I don't know how that would play out. I don't know if you have any ideas about how that vulnerability might play out.
Sure. It's funny because I'm just thinking here on the show, Ted, and it's the way I like to do the shows because I get epiphany sometimes, and I'm thinking about the whole philosophy of the question, and it really is a socio-political, religious question. It encompasses everything, really. If UFOs came here in the hundreds, I mean, it was an open, known fact. I mean, it would raise so many questions on all fronts, from power-hungry nations to, would they unite? Would they, would they change behavior? Would it change us as humans? There's so much questions answered and asked at the same time. I guess, okay, so we got a lot of exoplanets out there, okay, and we got a lot of chances of this happening, okay, and I mean, the question is not are we alone, is are we being visited? And I think a lot of people like to look at the ancient alien hypothesis because they can point to monuments or they can point to artifacts or they can point to the ancient alien hypothesis. But, do you think, it's been overshadowed by recent findings and you've been a MUFON for 40 years with testimony. Do you think testimony has been overshadowed now with an ancient alien hypothesis? It's been swamped.
Mm-hmm. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer who gave us the first Cosmos TV series and things like that, he used to say, I bet there's a million planets here in the Milky Way galaxy that are just teeming with life. But of course, they're not coming here. And the ufologists would just pull their hair out. What do you mean? Of course, if they're there, they can get here. At least some of them can get here. And so the ufologists have objected to that kind of refusal to face evidence that planet Earth has in fact been visited by UFOnauts. Now, you just asked as to whether or not the ancient astronaut theory, with its material evidence, would eclipse the anecdotal reports of UFO experiences. I think that was your question,
sure.
And I just haven't thought of it that way. I've just thought of it as, like an apple and a pear in a fruit basket. They sort of complement each other. I don't think they compete with each other, even though. I don't see any competition between those two.
The reason I ask is I think a lot of people want to look at shows like Ancient Aliens and look at the ancient history because I think people want answers. They want to know whether it's I think there's people out there and there's cases like, the Betty and Barney Hill story. What do you think of the Betty and Barney Hill story, for example?
Well, I think it's one of the most important abduction cases that we have, and the first phase, I'd say the first 4 decades of the UFO phenomenon. And I do spend some time in the book analyzing that particular case because it has a scientific structure or model to it. These spacelings who are investigating Betty's body and getting excited because Barney had false teeth, and they couldn't understand why a man's teeth would come out but a woman's teeth wouldn't come out. So you have the spacelings doing their research on them, which is a model that many UFO abductees had reported. And then you have that exciting story about the space map that by 1968 or 69
sure.
Had come to point to Zeta 2 Reticuli as being the location of the home of these UFOnauts. And also you've got, again, the beginning of the use of hypnotic regression for investigation. I think it's an important case. And I don't know if you remember, but Benjamin Simon, the psychiatrist, was considering possible explanations for Betty and Barney Hill having this largely shared account of their abduction, and he considered folie à deux. You remember that? Which is a folly or a delusion that two people share. Well, I just love that phrase. And here in California, in the Napa Valley now, we have a winery called Folie à Deux, and it was founded by a psychiatrist.
Wow.
I remember asking him, I said, do you know where that phrase comes from? It comes from a UFO abduction story. He says, oh, I know that. Wow. He says, that's why I named the winery this. So, at any rate, I think it's a good case. And again, note that it's benign or neutral. Betty and Barney Hill are not mistreated by the spacelings in
Sure.
quite a way that some of them complained about being mistreated in the late 80s and the early 90s.
Well, yeah, I had Kathleen Marden on the show on Stanton Friedman.
Good.
You must
Good.
know Kathleen. She's MUFON as well.
Yes, and she's also the niece of Betty Hill.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that was a fascinating show for me, and like you say, this was the case before all the cases that were coming out negative and mistreated, and you know, it was a landmark case and testimony, I guess. Back to theology, Ted. As a theologian, you must be well versed in the knowledge of other religions. Some liberal, some non-liberal. I mean, I'm limited in my theology knowledge of world religions. Catholic, Protestant, maybe I know. Islam, I'm not too overly familiar with. Hindu, a little bit. But I mean, all the world religions, Ted, you know, do you see the liberal religions, taking up or absorbing this UFO, or do you see the more fundamentalists having problems with it, or is it the same to all?
My observation is it's the same in all cases. In the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey, the evangelical category, which includes American fundamental, well, includes any fundamentalist because it was an international survey. There was no difference between an evangelical category and the mainline categories where your liberals are going to be regarding how they think about ETI. I mean, that's pretty much the same. Where you get these objections to UFOs or flying saucers because they're satanic. There's a small group, and I don't even think it's an organized group, there's a small wing of fundamentalist or creationist theology that suggests that belief in UFOs is a satanic belief, and that the UFOs which prompt that belief are really fallen angels or something like that. And you can go to their websites and see how they argue. And I want to make two observations about that. First, these are really small peripheral groups. They don't represent a large following, and they shouldn't because they're really quite bizarre.
Sure.
But then if you dig down underneath all this stuff about fallen angels and Satan, what they're really complaining about is evolution again. You might say, well, wait a minute, what do our UFOs have to do with evolution? Well, it comes from this widely held myth that evolution is taking place on these other planets, and that if a planet has evolved longer than on Earth, then those creatures, intelligent creatures, are more highly evolved than we are, and so if they come to Earth and make themselves visible, they're going to, God forbid, cause us to believe in evolution. And it's funny how the old evolution devil comes roaring back here in the UFO phenomenon. But at any rate, just watch for that. Yes, those voices are there, and I listen to them, but boy, it's really a marginal and small group, and doesn't really represent any major religious trend.
Sure. You know, Ted, we're coming up to the end of the show. Just want to quickly mention your website again, tedstimelyktakes.com. The name of the book we're talking about today is UFOs, God's Chariots. Very interesting discussion in the book. I don't think you can separate the idea of UFOs and theology, and I think you've done that credit. It's certainly a wonderful, interesting talking point, Ted. A couple of questions I kind of want to finish up on. I mean, do you think, it certainly makes sense to me that we're at an unusual time on our planet. It's an incredible time and journey we have been on in our human civilization the last 5,000 years. A very, very small window compared to our, Earth's history. However, where we are right now, we're at the threshold of being really advanced in a lot of areas and doing serious damage to ourselves with war. If there was ever a time for salvation, it's now. if there was ever a time that we could, really help each other as a civilization, and instead of being savages, and it's an unusual time. Do you think that may be the extraterrestrial agenda? And do you think that would be a plausible best guess scenario, that we are in need of salvation?
I share your, if I may use the word, anxiety about our circumstance, especially with
Sure.
regard to war and planetary degradation. And I can see why it keeps popping up again and again within the UFO phenomenon, because we are yearning for salvation, and we would like to find it. If we can, and we've tried the Democratic Party, that doesn't work. We've tried the Republican Party, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
We've tried the United Nations, that doesn't work. And so could there be an extraterrestrial civilization who could do something that we Earthlings have been unable to do for ourselves? I get the logic. I really get the logic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe I could close, if you could give me a few seconds here, with
Sure.
the way I close the book.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a story that you may know. It's November 26, 1977, the South England Television Network, about 5 p.m. The regular programming gets interrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this strange voice, and it says, "This is the voice of Asteron." So Asteron claims now that he's a visitor from space, and he's coming to Earth to help Earthlings prevent self-annihilation. And he says we have to put away our weapons of war. We have to embrace one another in love. We have to learn how to live in peace. And he gave a little 6-minute sermon,
Mm-hmm.
basically, until click, click, and regular programming went back on. And the officials of the South England Television Network did an investigation, and a couple days later, they announced to their viewing audience that Asteron was a hoax, and they guaranteed that that message would not be heard again on their station. I want to say,
Wow.
too bad. It's a great message.
It's a good message.
And that's why I say, yes, indeed, UFOs can be chariots of the gods.
Mm.
David Jacobs, and then in the 1990s, John Mack,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in which they're using hypnotic regression. They're retrieving now abusive stories that look kind of like sexual abuse and satanic abuse. And to me, the common denominator there in all of it is hypnotic regression. And so I just lay that before the reader and say, hey, what do you think? Could there be cultural winds blowing here?
Sure.
And I raised this with the researchers at John Mack's research group in Boston. And oh my gosh, they were horrified that I would suggest such a hypothesis. But something's got to account for the big change, and that's the best shot I can give it.
I got you. So, throw this one out there, Ted. Have you ever had a UFO experience yourself, of any class or any encounter? Witnessed?
I have not, but I've interviewed numerous witnesses, and I'm sometimes envious. Hey, I wish I could have that experience too.
Sure. People that have been abducted, have you interviewed people, abductees as well?
I have, mainly of the first type, but some also of the second type as well. And I've even talked with a couple of people who claim they're hybrids.
Wow. Wow. How long have you been interested in flying saucers, UFOs, whatever, these craft? How long does this go back, Ted?
Well, I started as a kid. It's post-genetic, to be sure, but it still goes back quite consider, and it has to do with culture. The continuity between the earlier and the later forms of UFO abduction is hypnotic regression to retrieve forgotten memories. As you may be aware, the technique of hypnotic regression actually was born in the UFO movement back in 1961, Betty and Barney Hill claimed to have been abducted by UFOnauts. And a psychiatrist in Boston named Benjamin Simon had used hypnotic regression in order to retrieve memories of the abduction, which occurred during a period in which they were unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
That abduction experience included both conscious and unconscious dimensions. But what was startling was the use of hypnotic regression to draw out the details. Well, in the late 60s, then through the 70s, you've got UFO investigators, Leo Sprinkle, James Harder, and others are using Benjamin Simon's technique for the purpose of gaining data about UFOs. And then in 1980, there's a big change. And what happens there, a book is published where a psychiatrist named Pazder is now using hypnotic regression to interview a woman named Michelle. The book is called Michelle Remembers, not to retrieve the memory of a UFO abduction, but rather childhood sexual.
A lot of coverage on this subject at the moment, Ted. I was surprised because I wasn't aware of the 77 book. I guess there's obviously a massive reason to re-release this. I guess timing is probably the first thing, Ted, more than anything. Would I be right with that?
Well, the UFO phenomenon changed a little bit. When I published my book in 1977, I was quite persuaded that I had understood what was going on. I was looking at structures of interpretation for these most unusual experiences, and I could see, for the most part, that people's experiences and thoughts about UFOs were quite positive. In fact, there were a lot of sublimated religious dimensions to the UFO phenomenon, and many people were hoping that an advanced extraterrestrial civilization would bring Earth the equivalent of salvation, world peace, and longer life, etc. But in the 1980s, a new thing was added, namely these very negative abduction experiences where people are arrested from their bed out of sleep in the middle of the night, taken aboard a craft, and they're abused, or at least they appear to be abused sexually, etc. And there's some reproduction going on. Some women claim to be impregnated, and some men have their sperm removed, evidently to use to make these hybrid babies that are a mixture of spacelings and earthlings. And then some women especially claim to have been abducted multiple times, and when they're taken aboard the craft, they're handed a baby, allegedly their own baby, and these feelingless grays watch them to see how they nurse their baby, evidently wanting to learn something about affection and motherhood and related matters. And initially, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, these people had negative experiences. They didn't like these experiences, whereas previously UFO abductions were religious turning points. Suddenly we get these negative ones, and that is what warranted the second edition of the book. I needed to somehow or other grapple with the meaning of this second category of abductions and see if I could integrate it at all with what I had learned previously.
Why do you feel that the change to this negative abduction phenomena to...
Well, I have a hypothesis which I ask the reader to sexual abuse and satanic ritual abuse. By 1982 in America, and I don't know if this happened in the UK, but it certainly happened in America, about 100 preschools are now in court with the preschool operators being prosecuted for sexual abuse and satanic ritual abuse, and the evidence used against them is gained through the hypnotic regression of the children who report sexual abuse and satanic ritual abuse. And in the Los Angeles County area, the biggest court trial was the McMartin preschool trial, which began about 1982 and ended about 1987, if memory serves me. And eventually, the McMartins, it's a mother-daughter combination, were found innocent. The parents had claimed that there was an underground subterranean worship center, ritual center for satanic ritual abuse, and the children were taken down there and abused. And, of course, when they dug down underneath the McMartin school, no such thing was there. But the evidence that seemed to clear the McMartins was that the counselors who were getting the testimony from the children were leading the children. So that's 1987 now. And just about then, we get a spate of books from a group of authors, Whitley Strieber and but Hop